natural cover that are greater than 20 acres. It's just over 4,000 blocks. Most of them are quite small, but the largest block is 150,000 acres. Our two data sets from 2011 and 2024 are similar, but we can't make fine-grained comparisons because they're at such different resolution. But in both cases, they show that we have about 72 or 73% of Vermont as forest block greater than 20 acres. So that's just mapping these intact contiguous units of natural cover. Our project, Vermont Conservation Design, which was really a way of getting at identifying features that are efficient ways to conserve species. As part of that project, we've stacked up different prioritizations of these forest blocks. And those are pieces, along with other pieces, that build into this Vermont Conservation Design map, the overall map that the effort produced. But I just want to focus really on three ways that we prioritized these forest blocks. For interior forest values and functions, for connecting values, and then for what we call geological diversity, or really representing all of the landscape of Vermont. So I'm just going to dig into each of those in turn. The interior forest blocks were an effort to identify which blocks in each of the 9 biophysical regions are the largest and have the most interior forest that's removed from the edge. So if you think about it, a round patch of forest will have more interior than a really long strip of forest where all of it might be close to the edge, even though it might be a large acreage. And you can see on the map there, the dark blue are the highest priority forest blocks for interior forest. For each of the biophysical regions, which I realize I neglected to put a map in, but you can see that in the Champlain Valley, the biggest patches of forest are much smaller than the biggest patches of forest in the Northeast Kingdom. It's just very different landscapes. And I'll put this up just to show we had these thresholds both for acreage and for the amount of forest that was greater than, forget the distance, it was, I think, 150 meters from the edge. Those big patches of forest do not, but we know because of what individual species need to meet their life needs, and as species shift their ranges generationally in response to climate change, we need to have forests and other natural communities. And so we did a second prioritization of the forest blocks that created a continuous network of stepping stones so that species can move from forest block to forest block across the Vermont landscape. So here, priority is not given location and that ability for species to use that block to connect to other places. You can look at it like this, where we have the interior forest blocks, and then we have these connectivity blocks that are providing this stepping stone function. And then even with those, there's still little patches that you see there in yellow, or areas along rivers and streams that provide really micro scale connections between patches of forest. Vermont fits into this much larger critical regional ecological connection that really ties the Adirondacks to the big landscapes of Maine and Quebec and Gaspé, and from Massachusetts up north. So we're really at the crossroads of ecological connectivity. And if we do not have ecological connectivity, we don't just isolate our species and forests, we cut off the Adirondacks from the rest of the Northeast natural landscapes and isolate those species. And we know that as species populations get isolated, genetic diversity and species are more likely to go extinct. We can look at connectivity at the really big scale, and then what plays into that is really often fine scale connections. And our high resolution mapping can really hone in on places where you can get from one forest block to another, picking up things like these patches together. We used the forest blocks to look at road segments and identify sections of road that have cover on either side, and so would be good places for species to based on the absence of other development. We've also mapped where there is forest and natural cover along rivers and streams, and those rivers and streams can be important connections in the landscape between forest blocks, particularly in places like the Champlain Valley, where we just have isolated patches of and a largely agricultural or developed landscape. Those riparian zones are really important for species like bobcat that want to move across the landscape but might open areas. The last piece are these geological diversity blocks. And the biggest blocks and the blocks that provide the stepping stones are not necessarily representative of all of Vermont's landscape. They are mostly biased towards the mountains and cold parts of Vermont that are rocky and undevelopable, because that's where we left our biggest forest. And when we start connecting our biggest forest areas, we're mostly in places like that. These are a set of blocks, the ones that are in dark purple, that are really collectively representative of Vermont's larger landscape that includes valleys and things like sand plains, clay plains, the hills of Orange County, which are limestone-rich bedrock and provide very fertile forest growing conditions. Trying to represent that full landscape of Vermont and not just end up with a prioritization of forests that is biased towards cold, high elevation places. There's some of the cool species that are tied to geology. So those three pieces are the prioritizations of forest blocks in Vermont conservation design. There's a bunch of other things in Vermont conservation design, like all the riparian areas are given some priority. There are fine scale features like individual natural communities. All that stacks up into the design, but I really wanted to focus on the blocks. And then I wanted to show how with the blocks, you can think about the functions you can think about the functions as occurring in parts of the block or having impacts to the block in different ways. And so I just want to draw a few examples of how Fish and Wildlife thinks about the impacts of development in forest blocks. So here's one forest block. This is Granville, and it's highlighted in blue there. You can see it connects to the left is the main spine of the Green Mountains, to the left of that blue highlighted block. And to the right is the Northfield Braintree mountain range. So two fairly large, relatively undeveloped areas with a lot of interior forest, but they don't actually connect across the Mad River and White River Valley in many places. This spot where those two patches of forest come together is sort of a hot spot for connectivity. And so within this small block, that is about 1,000 acres, and the transparency is a little weird. You can see there's Route 100 to the left, and then another road to the right. There was a proposal in this block to build a cell tower right in the middle of it. And as part of the Section 248 process, where there's a little more latitude for comments than in Act 250, Fish and Wildlife and the agency put in comments that a cell tower in the middle of a block might have an undue adverse impact on the natural environment, which is the review criteria there, but that if it was moved to the side of the block with some conditions, then that could be still adverse, but not unduly adverse, and something that the agency wouldn't oppose. And so this is an example of how we're using forest blocks to think about, okay, we don't want the whole block fragmented in the center, but some impact to the side might be okay. And there's I'm sort of glossing over a whole lot of details to this case, but I hope it's a useful illustration. Second thing here is that particularly with connectivity, where an impact in a block happens is very site specific. And so these highest priority connectivity blocks, where those solid blue arrows are places where there are places where block to block connectivity is really important. The areas circled in green, they're part of those connectivity blocks, but they're peripheral to the main connectivity function of the block. And an impact in those green areas might be evaluated very differently than an impact where those solid blue arrows are. And then there's places like where that dotted arrow is, where there's a more tenuous connection because of a lot of existing development. And it's a little less clear what the function is at that point. So I'm just laying this out that we've mapped these blocks, we've identified the functions, and those functions can help with evaluating the extent of an impact on the natural resource. Last slide.
Thanks, Bob. If you want to stop the share and then we can chat a little bit. Great. So before we move on, do people have comments or questions about what Bob was presenting? Want to dig a little deeper? We have a few moments here before we need to move forward. Go ahead, Ryan.
You put up a nice table there of minimum acreage size, I think, for blocks by a physical region. And you might have hit on it, but is that just based on an average block size in that region, a median, or kind of how did you come up with that minimum acreage?
Good question. And that's only for that interior forest prioritization. We looked at the distribution of block sizes in each region. I don't think we used a consistent cutoff, but we looked at what sort of thresholds would likely provide ecological. So it was thinking about the percentage of the land, thinking about like block sizes that could provide different functions, and making sure that particularly in regions that don't have a lot of forest, that we were enough places so that we'd have confidence that it would provide meet the life needs of the species there.
All right, thanks.
Other questions? Go ahead, Warren.
Hey there. Hey, Bob. Just quick question, or maybe just something that might be helpful for everybody is, before you said the forest blocks are about, I can't remember if it was 72 or 73% of the Vermont landscape. Are those further prioritized? And I'm just putting the geologic category aside and just thinking of the forest blocks and the connecting blocks. In other words, is there a ranking or a prioritization that the department has for those interior forest blocks? In other words, are they all going to sort of merit the same? They all merit the sort of the same importance, and or will they require the same sort of level of review?
Good question. Thanks for that. There's a couple of things there that I think to get at, which might not be exactly go along with it. So there's 4,000 some blocks left. If you take those three categories of prioritization, for each of those, we've done a highest priority and a priority category, as well as a basically not prioritized category. If you look at for all three of those categories, there's a lot of overlap. A lot of blocks are prioritized for two. I think in total, it's about 1,300 of those 4,200 blocks that are highest priority for any of the three reasons. So it's a much smaller subset. It's the acreage-wise, a lot of the acreage, but in terms of the numbers of blocks, it's a subset of the blocks. We have not gone further than those highest priority and priority categories. There may be some people who remember in 2011, the initial habitat blocks data set gave a score of 1 through 10 for all the blocks. And what we found was that score really just correlated with size. Even though there were lots of other variables thrown in, it ultimately came down to size and did not prove very useful. What is useful is thinking about the size of the block, the amount of core forest, and then the location and functions it provides. And I think VCE, the prioritization of high priority, does a better job of getting at that than like a numerical ranking that further subdivides them.
Thanks, Bob.
Go ahead, Annette.
So I think this is sort of a threshold question. In our review of creating this new criterion, will it only apply to these mapped areas, or when a project comes into Act 250 and people in the area know that it's actually a habitat connector and there's a forest there, it just doesn't show up on the maps, would it be excluded because it's not mapped, or are we going to allow that for consideration as part of this rulemaking?
That's a super good question, and we're gonna get into that in the next agenda item after we finish grilling Bob on the overview of these things. Yes, the rule says that the rule needs to address further defining what a forest block and habitat connector are beyond the definition given in statute, and needs to address size, location, and function. And so I think, Annette, your question is about it in just a moment.
Hello. I guess it's giving the option to restart the again.
I cancel first. For those of you that are on a technical issue at the moment in the room, can someone confirm if you can still hear us in the online world? You can.
We can
All right.
We can hear you. Yes.
Yes.
How about visual? Can you see us still?
Yes.
Yes.
It's just words
so,
keep getting interrupted, including while Bob was presenting.
When we started.
Gotcha. Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
So yes, I think the audio is an issue we're not going to be able to solve. So apologies for that. If we need to do some repetition, we will. We're having a little video issue in the room, but if that's not affecting the folks online, which it doesn't appear to be, then we can just keep going. So any other questions for Bob about his overview of forest blocks and not official sees them? Ed, it looks like your hand is still up. Do you have another question?
If it's for me, again, the audio cut out, but I took my hand down.
Okay, very good. All right, well, if there are no other questions for Bob, yeah, let's march forward and actually get into what Annette just asked about. So Act 181 gives us some marching orders about the types of things that and first of all, it provides us a definition, which is helpful. We don't have that in some elements of Act 181, and it's always better to have a definition. So it contains a definition of forest block. It contains a definition of habitat connector. However, if you've looked at them, the definitions are exceedingly broad. Some question during testimony and review of Act 181, whether this is my backyard. I have two. Is that a forest block because it shows up on a map as canopy cover? And so the Act tells us, as part of the rulemaking process, to talk about and specify, to go further and talk about size, location, and function as it criterion. And so Annette's question is a good one, and that's what I wanted to talk about, was a little bit on mapping. and those statutory definitions and refinements. So in terms of our existing mapping, I think that what we have for Vermont conservation design is probably the best that we have statewide right now. I know there are some municipalities that have gone further and have used, the abundant aerial imagery that we have to do additional mapping. Consultants have been hired. Dory Barton, who's one of our working group members and is a consultant, has done that work in at least the town of Charlotte. Dory, maybe you have done it elsewhere in terms of mapping forest blocks. And so there is finer scale data at the municipal level, but not on a consistent basis. So open question as to whether the mapping, needs to be consistent on a statewide basis, or whether we can dip into more specific mapping that has been at the municipal level. I guess before I skip over that, anybody have initial thoughts or that issue of mapping and where these things are?
I would just flag, it's important to remember that, as Bob explained, while Vermont Conservation Design prioritizes a set of blocks, it has mapped an exceptionally broad, over 4,000 forest blocks. So we have, as part of VCD, have mapped way more than is included in what's shown on the VCD map. So that work has been done. That makes sense.
You kind of lost me in the middle there.
You want to
but
say that
do
better?
you mean-
than I just said?
Do you mean with regard to the 20-acre sort of threshold that anything that was mapping as forest that was below 20 acres was kicked out, but we still know where they are? Is that what you meant?
We do know that, but I think what you're maybe getting at, Billy, is this idea that there's the universe of 4,000 blocks, but then when that are prioritization and function, we have a much smaller subset. Is that
Yeah, and that was 4,000 largely in map at like the local scale. Even though they're not part of the prioritization of VCD, we have them geo-referenced in there,
Gotcha.
all in one place.
Gotcha. Yes, good point. Yeah, so I think that belies my point, which is that I think that the overall Vermont conservation design data set is pretty robust. Even in the face of some maybe higher level resolution work at the municipal level. Seems like a good place to start. Any other thoughts on that? I'd like to get to a next question specifically. So Nat, if you want to go first, go ahead.
So I view this as very different from tier 3. It's almost the exact opposite of it. So with tier 3, you're setting out new jurisdiction in new areas. In this, you've got a project that's proposed. It affects a parcel. And then you look at what the issues are that are relevant to Act 250 on that parcel. In my experience, very often it is the people who live in the area who have the most knowledge about the wildlife and about the patterns. And so often things can be enhanced, such as the mapping, by what is developed around a specific proposal on a parcel. So I would just be very reluctant to see this rulemaking in any way limited to the A&R mapping tool, because I see that this is an opportunity to gain more knowledge and look at individual projects as they're proposed. That's how I'm looking at it.
Thanks, Nat. Warren, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say in the same vein that Annette was just describing, having studied the maps, and Bob and I spoke about this, and I think Billy as well. There certainly are, the maps are obviously not perfect, and there's definitely areas that are mapped as forest blocks that I think everyone would agree are not. But I think it might be helpful if A&R's got thoughts on this for the group. Again, maybe this is very much related to what Annette is asking, but maybe mine's the other side, slightly the other side of the coin. If the maps are, well, you tell me, Billy and Bob, I think the intent is not to use the maps as a jurisdictional tool per se. And that we know the maps are not 100% perfect. So in the net scenario, you've got areas that people in the community might believe are an area that should be mapped. And then on the other side, there's definitely areas that are mapped that probably shouldn't be. So just as a threshold matter, do we have any thoughts on how you want to address those situations?
Thought about this and with something that administered that's based on an existing body of scientific analysis and existing mapped resources. What we're proposing is that any forest block or connecting habitat impacts can be considered under this criteria, but that only forest blocks and connecting habitat that are identified in VCD, those would be the ones that needed to be addressed. Anything that wasn't identified as a priority in VCD would have a rebuttable presumption that impacts to those areas are not unduly adverse, but that parties could come in with evidence to say that this block has some unique characteristic and this development proposal has an undue adverse impact on that function or should be considered. So the universe is as broad as possible, but the only ones that automatically have the potential for undue adverse impact are those prioritized through the VCD. The smaller or less important blocks in connecting habitat have the opportunity to come in, but there'd be some obligation on parties to demonstrate that an impact was present. Is that a fair way of articulating it?
Yeah, and I think that is consistent with how a lot of other natural resources are treated, like deer wintering areas or mast stands, or even wetlands, where you have different categories of that thing. And you have guidance maps, but then the site-specific considerations come into play.
So, and I wonder if everybody understood what Billy's suggestion was. Does anybody not understand it or want to have a question about it? Because I want to talk about pros and cons, but I want to make sure everybody understands what he was saying. But I'm seeing hands, so I guess everybody got it. It's good. Megan.
Those priority areas, is that the 73% or no? Okay, thank you.
But from like a pneumatic perspective, there's roughly, if you're talking forest blocks, we've
Let's
mapped,
talk both. Like,
we've
what percentage of the state are we
we've
talking about?
mapped roughly 4,000 blocks. We're saying of that 4,000, 1,200 are the ones that we're really looking at every time in this criteria. But those other 2,800 are still out there, and someone could come forward and say, this area has some unique attributes, this project can unduly adversely impact it, it needs to be considered. But the obligation would be on other parties to kind of bring that information to the proceeding.
But Megan's question is a good one, and that is, okay, in that rubric, what percentage of the state is in those 1,200 blocks that are, the priority ones that would need to be assessed in terms of potential undue adverse impact? And we don't.
I think it's upper 60s, right?
I think that's right, but
Upper
that's-
60% of the state?
it is. But I think if you start paring down where development actually happens, it's going to be a much smaller percentage. So we look at 248 projects with this lens to an extent. And I don't know how many 248 projects we get, but I think we have maybe like fewer than 5 per year that actually raise some potential concern about fragmentation. Does that sound?
A lot of those blocks are above 2,500 feet.
Mhm.
Yeah.
They're within the Green Mountain National Forest, state forest, otherwise conserved. So like
Right.
you're starting to like narrow, and we've done some analysis that have kind of overlaid those areas with like conserved lands and otherwise. We can do more of that, but what we're just trying to navigate is the way the statute is framed. It defines forest block as anything that has, and connecting habitat as anything that has forests on or that things move through. So it could be everything that doesn't have pavement, essentially. So we're trying to say, what's a
Yeah.
reasonable way to kind of contain the conversation while providing the opportunity for people to bring in new information? And this is just for stuff that triggers Act 250. This
Right,
doesn't.
sure.
Oh,
Okay,
That's where we're starting, but absolutely happy to get thoughts and suggestions and holes poked by others.
yeah, so, let's see where we're at here for time. 45, 2:30. Okay, so we have, you know, to talk about size, look, have a role to play in potentially the proposal that Billy and Bob are putting forward in terms of, you know, where the forest blocks and connectors are locationally based on BCD. And for example, size. The BCD data set, and Bob, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it is looking at data that would help identify where forest cover was, and then determining how big each block of that forest cover was and screening out anything under 20 acres, right? So a patch of forest that is 10 acres in size is only 10 acres in size is not going to show up on that BCD data set, right? So we've already used the size function of BCD as a way to frame where the Criterion 8C review. We've already taken that into consideration. Should we go further? Is that the right size? Should we eliminate even smaller forest tracts? There's no magic to the 20 acres, right? There's a little bit of magic in terms of, you know, how much forest land you need to have to be enrolled in the current use program. And we often, you know, use that as a crutch. And that's 25 acres generally, if there's no home site on the property. So any thoughts on just the size question of where we might want to refine this very broad definition of forest blocks and habitat connectors? Okay,
It's hard to take them separately, because it really feels like the three different A, B, and C go together, and that as Bob and Billy laid it. Size is going to be a smaller parcel that's in a more critical area or has a higher function is going to make sense to protect, as opposed to maybe a slightly larger one that's isolated or doesn't otherwise have sort of functions that we care about. So to me, that seems like the size seems like the least important of the three of those.
okay. I see
Even though
the
size is a proxy for the other two, it's just what they said, how they originally the data was derived, but
We're still online.
Yeah, sorry, folks online, we're having an issue in the room, but assuming you can all still hear us, we will continue. Yeah, so Trey, your point is well taken. And I thought that Bob's slide that really did talk about location as it relates to function was helpful,
Yeah.
right? With the, you know, the connecting habitat with the green circles around the areas on the edges that maybe would have less importance from a connection point, and the blue lines that were solid being like, well, these are the more important connectors. So that's, to my mind, that's a question of location and function, right? And I think that also plays into the way that the Vermont Conservation Design has these habitat blocks and prioritize them based on those three functions: interior forest, connecting habitat, and geological diversity. So what about interior forest to a forest block? Should we prioritize those forests, those forest blocks, than edge forest? Because I don't think that BCD does that, right? Like, you've identified interior forest blocks, but there are still edges to them. It's not like you've taken it's not like you've extracted the edges out of those blocks, right? They still go right up to the meadow, right up to the house site. You've just tagged it with, this is an interior forest block. What do you think about that? About going further than what VCD did in terms of location and honing in on the interior of the interior forest blocks?
I think maybe that's just like what Trey was saying, that like you need A, B, and C to make this work. But I guess something about like, is it interior or not, seems to me more like something that goes into your assessment of the adverse impact and whether or not it's undue, rather than something at the start of the process.
Gotcha.
You have your universe of forest blocks, and we know that some have higher priority. That's a factor you consider when you're looking at the type of impact and the location of the impact. And all of that is stuff, it, meets the standard or not in the criterion.
Go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I have a little bit of a similar viewpoint because as I recall, when we were having a discussion about this was really to have a functional criterion in Act 250, that there really wasn't one that was really looking, forests. And so I think that there's the ecological value that we've been talking about. There was also some discussion about the fact that we do want to maintain, the viability of tracks to be working forests. So it's ecological. It's kind of like a holistic look at how do we try and have good site design in forests. And so I think because there's a number of jurisdictional, you're already under actually. How do we then look at appropriate design strategies? So I do agree that, we don't want to go so far as just looking at the ecological integrity and having a subset that's being reviewed. I agree with Bob. It may relate more to whether there's an undue adverse effect and how we consider that. But I guess the argument that we don't want to pale their consideration of tracts of forest land that are intact that relate to both ecological and overall forest functions and viability.
Gotcha. Yeah, so if you can't tell from my pokes and prods, is that I'm a GIS person, or at least I was in a former career, and I like universes that are as narrow as possible. And so that's what I'm trying to figure out in this question of a rule that could refine the definitions in the statute. Is there a way to narrow the universe? But I hear what you're saying, and that makes sense to me. And I think, to be perfectly honest, as Kirsten and I have talked about this ahead of this meeting, I think we both felt that the universe of AC would be large. It's a much larger area than anything we were talking about for the for tier 3. And so these questions, these points about like maybe keep the universe large and you address the importance of all, the pieces of that universe within the design and how that addresses adverse impact. That makes sense to me. Do others have thoughts about, again, size, location, and function with regard to what is the universe that we're talking about? Where are the areas where this would be applied, where Criterion 8C would apply? Because we're going to talk about the mechanics of how we determine adverse impact and what you do about it if that determination is made after the break, after we get through break.
Josh, did you have something?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a question or just the thought that's going on in my head, because, some of this is kind of new to me, but what I'm thinking could be a concern is I'm trying to understand how this, high priority forest blocks fits into the new tier 3 areas. And then this 8C criteria, 8C3 criteria, which is across all Act 250. And the idea that, high priority forest blocks, the interior ones of 20 acres more, all sounds fine relatively. You've got large owners that have parcels enrolled in Act 250, but what about that person that has 5 acres in the middle of an interior block that can enroll in Act 250 and it is something they're going to develop? Like, I don't know how it all is going to impact the ability of folks that have maybe smaller parcels that are forested that are part of these larger tracts, and they, aren't working lands, or they aren't, they're not able to take advantage of these other conservation opportunities, and it's their property that they have these development potentials for and pay property taxes on and have to be dealt with, and what the impacts are. I don't know how that all flushes out, and that's where my mind is spinning in all this.
No, it's a good question. Dory, did you have a follow? Or do you have a separate question?
No, I was just gonna comment in the same conversation, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I spend a lot of my time, I would say, in the wetland world, and that encompasses a very large area of the state. And for me, when I hear this conversation, and maybe I'm the only one, it doesn't seem all that dissimilar to me in terms of how we approach those situations with folks. And obviously that dates back to the 90s. And with time, folks have gotten used to the new reality, and which is there are a lot of wetlands in the state, there are regulations, and I unfortunately spend a fair amount of my time letting people know their development limitations on those lots. And so I guess I'll just offer up from the consulting world, it doesn't seem all that dissimilar for other resources that we have that are more regulated at this point in time.
Yeah, I think the difference is, to get to Josh's question or comment, is that, with the wetland permitting, that resource permitting programs through A&R, and if there's a wetland on the property, it has immediate ramifications as to the potential uses of the property. Whereas this criterion 8C for forest blocks and habitat connectors only comes into play if the development that's proposed on that 5-acre lot, Josh, or the 10-acre lot is under Act 250 jurisdiction to begin with, or the new development is creating the need for an Act 250 permit. So that's a different, there's a different thing happening there trigger wise. But I know from my past experience in the community that I practiced planning in for a long time, there are lots and lots of 10.1 acre lots spread out across that were created in order to avoid the need for a wastewater permit back in the day. And, those lots have a house on them, and then a good chunk of forest land that will likely fall within, portions of which will likely fall within these mapped forest blocks and potentially habitat connectors. So again, if that property owner was interested in doing some development that would actually trigger Act 250, then perhaps, perhaps they would be in that review and having to design the project to minimize the impact on the forested back portion of their property.
And can I just add one, just clarify?
Yeah,
So what we're proposing is that all forest blocks and connecting habitat could potentially be considered, but only those identified as priorities in BCD would have a clear potential for undue adverse impact. If it's a block that's small or doesn't have the size, location, or function that warrants priority, there's a presumption that there is no potential for undue adverse impact. So someone like in Josh's scenario, who's got a few acres of woods in their backyard, it's very unlikely they would be a VCD priority. There would be a presumption that they wouldn't even trigger like a response under 8C. But there's the opportunity for people to come forward and say, hey, this small area that's not prioritized in VCD has some very unique attributes that folks have not been aware of. And therefore, we're going to kind of rebut that presumption. So that functionality exists, but the default would be that those small or parcels that don't have the functionality or location, the B and BCD wouldn't have any kind of impact as a result of 8C.
Yeah, I think the clarity though is that, and Josh, you can speak up here, but your example was a property owner who was in the middle of a large forested area.
Got it.
That likely would show up as a priority area in BCD,
Got
and they just happen to own a 5-acre chunk in the middle of that, maybe with a few neighbors, because that's the
Right.
example I'm thinking.
It was
In
that,
Times
and
Square,
maybe
where I-
it's overlaid in a map in a tier 3 area that, so essentially any develop, almost depending how the rules shake out on that, would trigger Act 250.
Right, and I think just to add, another element of this rule is that the LURB is supposed to come up with like basically design guidance. So for the scenario you're talking about, Josh, it would be like, how does that person configure their project so that they can move forward with it and still comply with the criteria?
That's what we're gonna get to after the break,
Yeah.
and then if it is an undue adverse impact, how do you minimize it? And what kinds of design elements are we gonna come up with? Help people through that process and make sure the resource stays as intact as possible. Trey, go ahead, you had your hand up?
Yeah, wouldn't it be true that if, in Josh's scenario, if it's not a tier 3 area, it's just a 5-acre lot that somebody wants to develop a house on, it wouldn't even come into Act 250.
Depends on how long the road or
So I guess,
driveway
okay,
to
so it's
access
road
the
rule,
new
but just under 8C, 8C is not a trigger. The
Correct.
fact that you're putting a house in 8C is not a trigger. It's whether or not you implicate tier 3, you implicate the road rule, or you're otherwise jurisdictional.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So I think that's a really important thing to remember, is that this doesn't necessarily capture a single house development, for good or for bad.
But I think the road rule,
The road rule
for
might-
good or for bad, has targeted the house in the middle of the forest that is. And so that I don't know if I'm asking too much, but I would love to see a map of like, what are those priorities are already conserved in one way or another. So like, let's not worry about that. What areas may be exempt because we'll just go with the current exemptions because we don't have tier 1 mapping. So we're really looking at tier 3, tier 2 that's not conserved. How much area are we talking about and where are those? It would just, for me to wrap my head around it, that
Yeah.
would be helpful, both on the forest, and then I've got lots of questions on the wildlife piece too.
Habitat connectors, yeah.
Yep.
No, I think those maps were something we can prepare for the next meeting and
Yeah,
take a look at. I think you're right. A lot of people are more visual,
Yeah.
learners and, yeah, I'd like to bring you those maps, for sure.
I
Charlie?
think, Alex, just going off the top of my head, the highest priority blocks are something like 40% conserved. And then a significant remaining portion is enrolled in the, so that's just top of my head. That
Yeah.
is something that
So
we
that's,
can
I would just
create.
love to see that, just to be like,
Yeah.
okay, what are
Yeah.
we, how many potential Act 250 applications are we actually talking about? Because we're not gonna have Act 250 applications for all, like 90% of this, so it's just 10% of that land is potential to have Act 2, I would just help.
Yeah, well, hold on, Jamie. Charlie, did you have a follow-up
I
from
mean,
that?
Trey, I think hit on the main point, which is you have to trigger jurisdiction before the criteria comes into play. And I think when you think about, like the example Josh had, we have a 5-acre parcel and a highest priority forest block. Even if you did trigger, the road rule triggered it, there is also that idea of like, are there reasonable alternatives to what you want to do? And if you, like, it's this tiny parcel and you want to build a house there, what is the reasonable alternative on that lot? I think what this is getting at more is someone who wants to go create a bunch of 5-acre lots out in a priority forest block. This road rule plus this criteria allows Act 250 to look at site design. And back when this was originally being discussed in committee, I can pull out some examples of a project in Montgomery that is a perfect example of why this is important. So I think that's kind of, it's less about you have these existing small lots that are in interior forest blocks that someone might want to develop in the future. And I guess I see this more as if we're gonna continually create subdivisions of parcels in those forest blocks, new parcels, this is the trigger that allows for a review level that says, okay, how can site design reasonably minimize those impacts? So it's looking more at new subdivision of land into those small lots as opposed to you already have that small lot that already exists. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me, and as a planner, that's what I thought, you know, the benefit of this criteria was going to be in combination with the road rule. And I think we have ways to help people understand what good site design is, and the rules are gonna be written to hopefully reflect that. But at the same time, I think Josh's example and Megan's concern are going about, because as much as that's the intent, to the extent the net captures a lot of these other smaller lots where lesser development would be happening, but might be under Act 250 review, that's where I think we also need to figure out, like, do we want to capture those in the net? And in my mind, that's what the size, location, and function conversation was about, is like, let some of those pass, and not damage the resource in the process. Jamie, we'll go to you, and then we'll go to our folks in the online world.
I just want to quickly interject too. I think I'm not seeing the chat fully. So Bob, I think you're logged on to the meeting as well. Can you see, is there chat questions?
I lost my internet, so no, I'm not chatting anymore.
Well, we apologize if you put something in the chat and you're not getting a response. You may want to put your hand up and, you know, articulate it a different. We are plagued with some technology.
Thanks, Kirsten, for that. So yes, I would go.
One other thing that comes to mind in terms of this idea of how many exist to what and where, this idea of like, there's a 5-acre parcel way out in the middle of a habitat block that hasn't been developed, someone wants to, those might exist out there, and they probably do to some extent, but I guess I would wonder how many of those exist versus how many of them like already have roads going to them, right? Because like chances are when those parcels got developed or subdivided, somebody had already punched in a road to get to it prior to the road rule being in existence. So I guess, I think you're right. You gotta look for that one outlier that might really jam somebody up, and I appreciate it. And I think this is more of like what is coming, because to that end, like when somebody subdivided that lot, they did it for a reason, and they probably punched in the access ready. So I don't know if we can do a GIS model of how many parcels under 10 acres exist without roads in priority forest blocks, but
It's fun.
But, like,
It's interesting because we have the technology, right? We have statewide parcel mapping now. We have a statewide conservation mapping. So there's a lot that we can do.
That-
Look, I don't want to chase the one exception and then write the rule for that one, but I just want to be cognizant of the fact that that exists. And I'm thinking of a specific example in Heinsberg where I had a landowner on the end of one of those roads that was punched in, 10.1 acre lots all along the road. To other and the road rule, an additional road, maybe would have benefited from this kind of review criteria to refine, you know, exactly how far into the woods that new lot went. But so Jamie, you're next, and then we're gonna go online.
Yeah, just a couple of quick points. This is a good conversation. You know, I think the question of, there's a tendency to look at this almost as if like prohibiting activity. And I think a lot of this criterion is going to shape development. As Charlie was saying, it's going to encourage good site design. If somebody can't get over the hurdle, they're going to have an undue adverse effect. Right? Then I think we have to tackle as a group, are there certain circumstances that would still allow that mitigation, for example, or not? So I think we're going to have a whole conversation about sort of what level of impact is going to be acceptable and how do we have good site design to discourage it. And then Megan, it's a good question, how much is conserved? And I think if we look at, as Bob was saying, we can get the numbers on permanently conserved, and then there's over 2 million acres in current use. And I think we could look at the average amount of acreage that comes out as an estimate maybe of what would be in place. Pretty small number as far as I remember. Maybe it's up.
Small year over year.
There was an uptick, after COVID.
And also the location of those tend to be adjacent to roads, tend to be, so just by nature of the land that's coming out of there and the reason land comes out of current use tends to be to develop that house for the kids or to sell that lot. And so in those cases, it's already doing site design because they're going to do the lot that already has access. And it's cheaper, it's easier, it makes sense. The utilities are there. So I think like there's a lot of these things that are kind of already happening. And so we're kind of like the very fine point of the funnel, if that makes sense.
Okay, Annette, you were up next.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Bad analogy.
And I have a few comments. One is that Charlie's presentation that he gave to the House Committee is available on video. Charlie, I don't know if you want to find it and send it to the group, but it's a very good visual and an explanation of why we're here doing what we're doing. And I remember Ed Stanek did something similar probably 20 years ago, showing using maps in a Senate committee, I think, how I think it was a 700-acre parcel got divided up and developed all entirely by avoiding Act 250. So the other point I wanted to make, which is kind of following up on what Jamie said, is that just because it requires Act 250 doesn't mean that it's going to be denied. It's not really a stop on development. And on interior forests, because this criterion's already been used in renewable energy projects, I'm thinking about the Deerfield wind site, and that was critical bear habitat, and there was a study required, and a thesis was done that came out in May that really hasn't gotten any press, but I'm going to put the link to it in the chat because it is a very thorough evaluation based on a lot of data about the effects on the bears of building roads. And, you could substitute wind turbines for houses. What happens when you develop an interior forest and create human activity? And so I'm just going to put that in there. But I on the small tracks, I live in an area that has a lot of these, what we call spaghetti lots, 10-acre lots with all the forests at the back and the houses in the front. And that's the area that I find in my own neighborhood actually is habitat connector. And I could tell you where the bears cross the road that go from the Green Mountains over to Connex. It doesn't show up on a map. And from a public participation perspective, I do not support Billy's proposal that these maps come in with a rebuttable presumption, because it's hard enough to be heard in a regulatory proceeding if you're a member of the public, but it's even harder if you're having to do battle with a state agency that's taken a position that you're having to counter. And so I think it's fine. I mean, we all know these maps exist. Obviously, they're going to be used in the regulatory process, but to set it up so that you have to come in and overcome the agency's position, I don't think is necessary in implementing this criterion.
Okay, thanks, Annette. Anybody else online have their hand up, Kirsten? I'm not looking.
Nope.
No,
Oh, and that still has her hand up, but I think it's just a
right,
straggler.
remnant.
Yeah, I did as well. Thanks.
Oh, who's that?
Dan Bauer.
Go ahead. You'd like-
Yeah, thanks very
You'd like
much.
to
And
speak
perhaps
now?
picking up on some of the uncertainty that Annette may be suggesting, not to put words into your mouth, or what Dory mentioned about the similarity to wetlands and their functions and values. I had the pleasure, and thank you, Liz, for organizing a great event last week, of attending the Northeastern Old Growth Conference held at Bread Loaf over in Ripton, and went on a hike with Charlie Cogbill in the Lord's Hill area of Marshfield and asked him what the function of this beautiful patch of older forests with giant sugar maples might be. And he said, well, essentially research. And, that was a little hard to swallow. And so I'm wondering if this third leg of the stool should be explored now, or if we might be taking a session to do that. I could see location and size is relatively quantifiable, still needs consistent, clear language. Is function something that we'd like to dive into? I see the word scenic beauty, which I think a lot of us can agree on to some great extent, as something to be considered. Is that something that we'll be defining much more specifically so that property owners, as well as the district coordinators or volunteer citizen planners, can wrap their heads around?
Boy, that's an interesting question, Dan. I hadn't really thought about that. That's why these getting a lot of opinions is a good idea. My thinking about the function of forest blocks in particular, let's leave habitat connectors aside for a moment, because I think their function is a little clearer. But my thought about what the function of a forest block was ecological and less about scenic or aesthetic qualities, and more about carbon sequestration, habitat, absorption of stormwater runoff, all of those things. What do folks think about other functions that these forest blocks have that we should be thinking about along those lines? And we're noting that Act 250 under Criterion 8 has aesthetic criteria separate from this one. Ryan, you haven't spoken in a while. Go ahead.
Sure. My mind on the ecological side goes to supporting forest interior species, right? We have species that aren't going to use such habitat, at least not in important parts of their life cycle. So parsing out the core forest within the forest blocks has value in that. But recognizing, as we heard here, it's not just that, but it's, forestry value, recreational value in addition to that. But on the ecological side, that's where my mind goes.
Did you want to say something, Jim? No. Okay. Charlie, you were going to come in.
I think it's a really interesting point about function and how different successional stages of a forest provide different functions, and certainly an old forest provides a different function than a young forest. I think the key here is keeping forests as forests over any successional stage. So I think if I'd be a little bit hesitant if this process gets into using successional stage of a forest as an example in a review criteria, because that changes. And I wouldn't want Act 250 to say, oh, you can't do that 10-acre clear for this specific species here because of this current forest condition. So I guess where I'm coming from, I see it more keeping forests as forests for the potential for any future function, whether it's growing old forests or creating young forests, or function, as Jamie pointed out, the ability to manage forests, or whether it's passive management or incredibly active management. That's what I would see there.
Yeah, well, that's a whole nother side of function, right? Is silviculture and the working landscape, and an ecological standard or function.
But I guess my point is ecological function is the potential for function as opposed to the current function occurring in that forest. That makes sense.
Right. We have to see in that fourth dimension of time.
Yeah.
And this is making me think that I neglected a really important point when I was introducing forest blocks, which is that Fish and Wildlife considers forest as any success. And I did say right down to having just been cut, all of that is considered part of a forest. We consider broadly that silviculture and forest management activities do not fragment a forest block, that's a part of how we see intact forest.
Right. And I think that's reflected in the statutory definition of a forest block that we have to work from, which is yes, a forest in any successional stage, even right after all the trees just got cut down.
Mm-hmm.
And I see your hand is up, but I don't know if that's a remnant. If it's not, feel free to chime in again.
I don't know what's happening, but I took it down 5 minutes.
Okay, good enough. Well, this is a good time to pose questions that you want to hear answers to at our next meeting on these topics of size, location, function. Anybody have other or desired maps they want to see in order to push this conversation along next time?
Are you thinking that map out, like for size, location and function, you're gonna delineate those like in the wetland rules or other rules? You're gonna provide examples of function and examples of the locational, like that's part of the rulemaking that's gonna come forward is to flesh those out or?
Maybe.
Maybe. I think part of what's happening with this conversation is where should that emphasis be? Should that emphasis be in the determination of adverse impact and how to minimize and deal with that adverse
That
impact?
makes sense.
Or is it an upfront conversation about what is a forest block to begin with? And I think you and others have said, like, maybe it's not part of that first conversation about what a forest block is. We're dealing with a larger universe of those, and it's more important in the second conversation.
It might help to be determinative of whether something, I mean, if you're outside of the 1,200 parcels that, if we follow the proposal from A&R and you're outside of the 1,200 ones that already as you know, having any impacts that have the potential to be undue adverse. And the other ones function might be important to help determine whether or not it's jurisdictional. If somebody came forward and
Yeah.
they're gonna need to make an argument based on size, location and function.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I
To
think
reflect that presumption.
it speaks to Annette's suggestion
Yes.
that there's local knowledge and that the mapping is never going to be accurate enough to drill down to the parcel level per se. And so it would be helpful, I think, if the rules provided some context so that a district commission who's in the process of reviewing an application and is hearing from a local neighbor, like, this is what I'm seeing, they can be like, well, does it meet these tests? If it does, then yeah, let's really get into it. If it doesn't, then no.
So if it meets these tests, who is paying for those tests? I think there is, I'm gonna push back heavily on the idea that a developer has endless amounts of money to pay for studies and tests, and that the onus should be on the developer if a citizen comes in and says, I think there is something there. I don't know it, but I think possibly. I think we areas back to this 50 areas where someone can say maybe there, and now the developer is paying for a lot of studies to show that it's not there or show that it is an endless amount of money for someone who is trying to help us solve our housing crisis. And I am going to push back heavily on the idea that we should require anything that a citizen brings forward to be put on the developer to do.
That's consistent with what we're proposing.
No, that was in response to what
Yeah.
you said.
And Megan, that's consistent with what we're.
That
proposing.
is what I thought was
That
consistent.
the
with what you
expectation
were
is that
proposing.
there is things there is carry that forward. And I think what Alex is talking about is put some side around what that process would look like for people to bring those issues forward.
Yeah.
To make it easier for them in commissions, but it wouldn't be on the applicant per se.
Yeah.
That's, okay.
It's also hard for the applicant to prove person, putting aside the citizen coming in, to have an applicant who's a, you know, regular citizen do something and say, I don't know how to prove this, no undoing, like that's an equal burden as opposed to rebutting something a citizen's got. If the expertise lies with the state, then we should be able to.
Yeah, like the rest of the natural resource criteria, the burden is not on the developer. The legislature chose to put it on the developer here. We've argued that it should shift back to non-applicants, but that's probably a conversation for another day. It's almost time for a break though.
It is indeed. So let's do that. It's 2:31. So let's take a break. 15 minutes. We'll get back at 2.
We're gonna play around with our technology a little bit and.
So there was an email from ADS that said internet connectivity, both wired and wireless, has been on the
On the Fritz.
on the Fritz, so that's possible.
Isn't that email go out like every day?
Yeah, it seems frequent. So Kirsten, do you wanna mute
Doesn't.
us for the time being so that online
Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah, it is. I mean, yeah, back
A
then.
newbie on the. All right, everybody, we are back. It is 2:46. Your break is over.
April.
We're gonna get started again. If you wanna turn your screens on so we can see you.
Wonky mouse too on top of.
Answered your question. Your question was, have you mapped the overlap between these four sector areas and already conserved lands? And the answer is yes. That was brought up earlier in the meeting. Megan, really helpful to be able to visualize. And so, yes, I think for our next meeting or before, I'll be working on some mapping to show sense of which conserved and which. So, with that said, I'm gonna turn it over. Yep, I'm gonna turn it over to Kirsten, and she's gonna walk us through a little bit of the analysis that we might need, that we're gonna need to do, or that our district commissions are under Criterion 8C.
Yeah, so bear with us. I had in mind that I would put up a visual, but I'm just gonna talk through some things here. People who don't know, before I served as a coordinator administering Act 250 for about 19 years. And before that, I was in consulting. And I, make sure that the administrative side is as ambiguous as it can be. And so I've been thinking about the language in the statute and, how the analysis will work. And I just thought the other criteria, Act 250 review works. Still have people online. For anyone who may not be familiar with the Act 250, deals with scenic beauty aesthetics.
You're frozen and we've lost you.
We got an email about state, about connectivity issues at state offices, so it might be related to that.
So we've lost the room, I guess.
I just sent a note to one of the people there to let them know.
So Gene, I've been playing around with the ANR Atlas and it has the layers for the conserved lands and for the habitat and connectivity blocks. So you should be able to find them. They're under the forest and parks and recreation, you'll find the conserved land inventory, and then under fish and wildlife, you find the habitat blocks.
Hey, Ed, are you there? This is Warren.
Hey, Warren, we barely heard what you just said.
Just wanted to see if you could hear me well, sort of disconnected from the state. The question I was gonna ask that I would imagine you'd also be interested, I think others should be or would be, is when they develop this rule for 8C, will the PUC and or ANR use it and apply it in 248 citing cases? Or
The
will
P, well,
ANR,
so Warren, A&R or the PUC already does apply forest fragmentation and habitat connectivity
oh,
criteria, and
oh,
I
I know,
and I
I know,
asked,
but go ahead, sorry.
well, I actually asked them how come they can do it if Act 250 can't, and they said that we use our the statutory language having to do with the natural environment.
Yep.
And so I don't see that there's any need for them to import this specific criteria into what they've already been doing.
Well, I guess what I was, and I realized that they've been using 248 process, using this forest block issue in that I was familiar with the Verizon tower that got denied up in Waterbury area. But practical things, for example, like appropriate ratios for mitigation. I mean, there are certain mechanical things that this rulemaking calls for that I guess I would assume or hope they would be consistent and how they apply it. But anyway, that's a question I have because quite
Yeah, I've
frankly,
seen them use it in a solar project in Brandon, which was at a
yeah,
pinch point, and I've seen them use it in the Lowell Wind project, and they
right.
actually held a hearing on it. Um, I think that the topic that we're about to discuss is probably the relevant one. Their standard appears to be minimize, mitigate, and avoid. And I know that I testified, and so did a couple of others, I think Billy Coster and Bob Zano, saying that the standard should be undue adverse effect. So there is that difference in how the PUC might evaluate it if that was the standard in Act 250 differently from how they are doing it. I don't know.
I'm told they're working on the tech.
Gotcha.
Hey, can folks in the Teams meeting hear me?
Can hear you. Yes, Billy.
Okay,
Now I
yeah,
can.
I'm in the room. The official Teams is having a real issue, so I'm on my phone. If Alex and Kirsten are so inclined, we might try to just use my phone and see how people do with that. So, we're gonna try that, and then you can tell us whether that works or not.
Billy, this is better than it was before, actually.
Okay, well, I'm holding the phone, speaking right into it, but it might get a little more challenging when other people talk, but we'll do our best.
So can you guys see us?
No.
Okay. Yeah, we did get an email about internet outages and so on, so apologies. Did you miss everything that I was saying after the break?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll start again. So, for those of you who don't know me, I worked for a lot of years as one of the Act 250 coordinators administering Act 250. And before that, I was in consulting. And I'm thinking about this in part, looking to make it as clear and unambiguous as possible. And I've been thinking about the mechanics of the analysis and this statutory language of undue adverse impact and how, you know, those words appear in other criteria and how those analyses work. And I was going to have a visual, but that's not happening. So bear with me. I'll just give a very brief thumbnail for those who may not be familiar with how Act 250 Criterion 8 scenic beauty aesthetics works. So there is some precedent that breaks apart the question of undue adverse effect into the two parts. The first part being, is there an adverse effect? And interested parties in the commissions are, you know, presented with some suggested questions that get at what is the setting, the context, the existing scenic character of the, you know, the area where the project is to be located, that help inform whether or not the commission deems that the project creates an adverse impact. If there's not an adverse impact, then that criteria is met. Like you get, you know, you pass go. If there is an adverse impact or a potential adverse impact, then the evaluation goes to the next level and looks at these three factors to determine if the adverse effect is undue. And those three factors are shocking or offensive to the average person, which some might, you know, say is awfully hard to interpret, but you know, three commissioners getting together, and in my mind, that's kind of the, you know, you're driving down the road and something's there and it's kind of, whoa, like it's a pretty high bar, shocking or offensive. The next part of the second layer of the test is what concerns whether or not the project conforms with a standard put forward and in effect at the local level that concerns scenic beauty, natural beauty aesthetics. So if the project does not conform with such a municipal standard, if one exists, then that is part of the evaluation. So I'm not explaining this very well, but these three factors that come into play at this sort of second level of review, if any one of them are not met, then the criteria is not met. So one has to satisfy all three. The third one looks at mitigation. And so if the applicant is able to successfully mitigate, then that factor is met. If the applicant does not mitigate, in a way that the commission would deem a reasonable person would do, then that factor is not met. And just maybe a quick example of that might be, let's say, just random example, relatively large new building in a certain setting, and the owner is proposing a bold shade of blue, like, prominent. And the commission says, oh, that's pretty, out of character with the area. Might you consider, a different shade? And the applicant says, no, this is, this is this particular color scheme, and they won't do any landscaping. So the commission says, well, You could mitigate that aesthetic effect by incorporating landscaping and maybe toning down the color, but the applicant won't. And so the commission could say, well, you're not mitigating. You have opportunities to mitigate, you're not mitigating. So again, this analysis is looking at the question of whether or not the adverse effect is undue. And if any one of those three factors is not satisfied, then the criteria is not met. The way Criterion AC is worded in the statute, the way I understand it and currently interpret it is, there are also these factors. It starts from my perspective, starts with this question of is there an adverse effect? Like, is the project located in one of these forest block or habitat connectors? And then is there an adverse effect? If there's not, you get a pass. If there's an adverse effect or potential undue adverse effect, then it looks further to determine if to what extent the project has avoided, minimized, mitigated. And so I'm hoping that I'm so excited that this group of people is coming together to have this robust conversation around how to make this as clear as possible and define a standard for what is avoid, what is minimize, what is mitigate. And like I said, my interpretation of the statute is if you satisfy any of those three, then I think you get a pass, but it also says subject to the rules of the board. So I think, I really look forward to hearing from everyone, like, how do the mechanics of this, what's meant by that, try to keep it user friendly, not have to get overly complicated. I'm also thinking of the early era of Criterion 9B, and this is stretching my memory a little bit, but there was in the prior version of 9B, the requirement to cluster and assess whether or not the applicant had sufficiently, avoided and minimized impact. And from memory, I think if an owner impacted a third or less of that particular resource located on a parcel where development was occurring, then that was considered not a significant reduction. So, and I think, to the extent there's opportunities to develop some simple metrics that people can apply will really, from my perspective, in terms of the administrative side of things, go a really long way to help ease frustration with applying this new criteria. So that's what I'm hoping can occur with this work. So, and I look forward to hearing from everyone, like what do you think is meant by avoid, minimize, mitigate? And I know we sort of started getting into some of that, this morning or prior to the break. But I don't have any of my own kind of like preformed ideas of exactly what I think those things mean. But I want to hear from everyone else. What do they think? So do we want to start with avoid?
So here's how I want to start. Because of these technology issues, and thank you, Billy, for allowing us to use your phone as a mic. I kind of want to hear from the people online first, because I don't know how long we're going to have you, and it's going to be a lot easier to hear you than it is for us to pass Billy's phone around as a microphone. So can we take it one at a time? I think that the first test, as Kirsten said, is whether there's an adverse impact in the first place. So do people in the Teams room online have thoughts or questions about what that means, or yeah, how we would how a district commission would make that initial determination? And you may need to just speak up because of the Teams technical issues. I think some of the raising hand functions are hard for me to see at the moment.
Dory has her hand up.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
so
Thanks.
go for it.
I think that's a great question, because I found myself wondering, are we out of the gate saying that any impact is an adverse impact? Is that the starting point that we're, and I think that that's a big question for me is, is there any amount of impact that is out of the gate not going to be considered adverse?
Yeah, good question. Do others have thoughts on that? I have some thoughts on that, but I don't want to seed the conversation quite yet. So let's assume that you're in Act 250 jurisdiction, you're in front of a district commission, you have a development project, and that project is going to be in an area that we have deemed a forest block. Okay, that's the hypothetical. So now the question is there a test, as to an initial test as to whether that development has an adverse impact?
What if it's a redevelopment? Sorry, for folks online, this is Megan. If it is an area that's already been developed, that is redeveloping, that's under Act 250, that's redeveloping site rather than building in a greenfield, can that be taken into consideration about adverse impact? Less adverse than if it was happening elsewhere, and if it's in the same footprint, should it automatically go in?
Yeah, and I think that speaks to some extent on to what extent the forest block is being impacted, right? So if it's somebody who's currently under Act 250 jurisdiction because of a past subdivision or whatever, and they are redeveloping, as Megan said, or maybe they're putting an addition on their house, but they're not cutting down a single tree. Like, does this criteria, do we have an adverse impact? That's one example. Another would be they're under current jurisdiction, they have a home there, and the redevelopment they're doing does cut a tree, or maybe four. Like, is that an adverse impact? And how do we make that determination at the front end?
I think it's really important that we distinguish what you do.
This is Bob Zanos talking and just bringing the mic to him.
Like being at a conference where they run the mic out. I think that the adverse impact to a forest block is going to be really different than the adverse impact to a habitat connector. And it's almost like there's two parts to the criterion that we need to parse out.
Agreed. They are different. But maybe for the sake of the hypothetical, we can just work on the forest block for the moment. And to get to Megan's point, I think about should we have some sort of test that will determine that there's an adverse impact, or is it any impact whatsoever within that?
This is Billy. To what Bob was saying, I think it's adverse impacts to the functions and values of those resources. So I think we'll have to define what those functions and values are, and whether the activity has the severity of the impact on those functions and values be a place to start. Because like on a large forest block, if someone's doing a small amount of development right on the road edge, that's likely, though that might be modestly adverse, but that's probably fine without any other conversation, because the interior forest function of that block is not being impacted. So I think like all that stuff will have to be kind of like mapped out a little bit. I'm looking at Bob because he's the expert here, but yeah. And the other thing I'll say is that this criteria has effectively been applied at the Public Utility Commission for 15 years. So I think we've begun to pull together like past cases to see how this analysis has been conducted there. And hopefully that will be a good resource for this group.
This is Annette. To compare it to the PUC, I can think of maybe one solar project that was found to not have an adverse aesthetic impact. That has most often not translated into having an undue adverse aesthetic effect. So I'm not sure that the adverse part of it is anywhere near as important for us to focus on as the undue adverse part of it. And Melinda has her hand up, and then so does Dan.
Thanks, Annette. I appreciate it, because I unfortunately am unable to see folks with their hands up at this point. So yes, if folks who are online want to just jump in a little bit, it's okay if you talk over each other, just, one at a time as you go. So yeah, Dan, go ahead.
Melinda was first.
Great. Melinda, go ahead.
Sure. So, I mean, I can think of some kind of simple tests that we might consider, and that's, for example, maybe an expansion of an existing structure might not pose an adverse impact. Like or an expansion by a certain percentage, something like that. Building an accessory structure that's close to a primary structure or close to the development, and then you'd have to figure out, well, how close. Construction of certain things, like maybe I don't know, or just like low impact clearing or thinning or something like that. Those are just some examples of factors that you might consider for a finding of no adverse impact. Just
Gotcha.
some thoughts. Yeah,
Thanks, Melinda.
sure.
I'm wondering if, as we talk about this as a test or a threshold, what occurs to me is on the local level, zoning ordinance will often discuss non-conforming uses and the threshold at which the non-conforming use is acceptable. And sometimes it means the building expands by no more than 25%. And so there's this dimensional standard. And so we could think of is the existing development footprint that may have an adverse impact expanding into the habitat block, perhaps, or reducing it within the given property by a certain percentage. But then with these non-conforming uses, they're often re-examined if the use itself were to change. And so perhaps in this context, we can imagine if, and then this might also be governed on the local level as well, but if a residence or one type of business changes to another type of business, it might actually create a new type of adverse impact. We can imagine one perhaps that uses a lot of overnight lighting. And that can have a significant adverse impact on wildlife. And so perhaps in addition to a dimensional standard of adverse impact, we need to consider use or change in use.
Thanks, Dan.
I guess I'd be inclined to follow kind of the idea that Annette put forward, that we know what impacts forest blocks, and it's the permanent conversion of forest and natural habitat to some other type of thing that's not part of that block. We can, at a 0.5 meter resolution, map that over the long term, more or less. And there's going to be, I think, just an immense range of things that do that will not be unduly adverse. And there'll be, I think, all the things that were just being brought up now, ADUs maybe in the right context, or additions to buildings. I mean, there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands of times that happens, and it's not unduly adverse. And I think it seems like there's room here to keep it very simple, that adverse impact is loss of the thing that provides the function, which is the natural habitat, and then spend our time working on what's undue rather than trying to find some threshold to start with for adverse.
Thanks, Bob. Any other thoughts in the Teams world that I can't see?
There are no hands up.
Thanks, Annette. Any other thoughts in the room? Jamie, maybe?
Certainly understand, why we'd want to look at de minimis impacts or what would not even trigger the realm of review. The only thing I guess I would caution us is to make sure that within that definition, then there's not the ability to sort of abuse it so that you can game the system, right? So if it's like you're doing something on cleared land, people aren't going out clearing like a disturbed area and expanding the area of disturbance. And I know it can get into sort of like the administrative side of related to also forestry roads that are really for development, right? It's sort of the same analysis. So I think we want to just make sure that whatever definitions we have are will function well.
Hey, this is Trey, everybody. And I just have more of a question back to Bob and Billy is it, and I know ANR has put forward a proposal around the 1,200 versus the 4,000. It's just the proposal. It's kind of the straw that we're looking at now. It may not be where we land, but I thought that proposal was that if you're in the 1,200 and there's, some minimal expansion of disturbance to the natural ground cover, it's automatically undue adverse. No?
Got the potential.
We're gonna have trouble with back and forth conversation in the room, so.
I think what we're saying is that in those areas, then there's the clear potential for an undue adverse impact. So there's the assumption that the analysis takes place. In those, in those other areas, the assumption is there's no potential for undue adverse impact. So the analysis does not take place unless other information is brought to bear that kind of bumps it up.
Yeah, and I think one of the benefits of using the Vermont Conservation Design Forest Block database is that areas around homes have already been extracted from it. So some of the questions about like, can I put an addition on, or can I put a garage next to my house within a forest block, go away if we use that as the starting point, because they're not in the forest block to begin with. So that from a mapping standpoint, I find that helpful. But I'm curious what folks think about if we focus in on undue. Like, I like the concept that undue adverse impact is about the function of the resource and less about the specifics of the development itself. And I wonder if folks have thoughts on what kinds of factors we would talk about in terms of making that determination of an undue adverse impact as far as a function of the forest block, for example. Yeah.
Some meeting attendees are not able to get back into the meeting remote. I just can't get back into it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we're having continued technical difficulties. I don't know how to solve those. And maybe, sorry to do this to you folks who are on Teams, but maybe the folks who are actively participating could just check in briefly.
There are 16 of us here.
Excellent. Thanks, Annette. Yeah, I think we just continue for now and do the best we can. If we've got 16 on Teams that are still there, that's close to what we started with.
Liz here.
So,
This is fine. The audio is fine.
Yep.
Yeah,
So
this is
getting
working well. And just to clarify, Alex and Kirsten are identified as part of that 16.
Gotcha. Thank you. Okay, so again, my question was, do folks have thoughts on the functionality of the forest block or the habitat connector, and what kinds of factors we might think about in making that undue adverse determination? Hold on, Charlie.
Alex, this is Warren. Wouldn't that, I'm sorry to interrupt, I obviously can't see. Wouldn't that be a question for ANR? In other words, there must be a list of the different functions, like we talk about wetlands. People use that analogy. What are the different functions of an interior forest block? Are they going to be unique to each block, or is there sort of a, I hate to make this sound trivial, but a checklist, a standard checklist of the functions, and then you would take a look at the project and say, does it impact that function? The example before of this project requires excessive lighting and operation during the night. That's going to have, potentially an impact on certain forest functions that other projects, I think most of the projects that were contemplated when we did the road rule and we worked on this were the spaghetti subdivision lots. Charlie's description before was spot on. I had my hand up and put it down because so I think that's what we all have in mind. So I don't know if ANR has a sort of a laundry list of things they would look at to see, does this project impact any of those those particular functions? And
So-
then how would you deal with that?
So Warren, thanks for the comment. And I was going to hand the mic here to Charlie Hancock, who, one of our ANR folks. But I would say this working group was put together, with all due respect to ANR, not just to rubber stamp what ANR is proposing, but because we have other ecologists and folks who are familiar with forests and wildlife habitat to be able to offer up their own opinions about what those important functions are and what we might use for factors to understand what an undue adverse impact is. But with that caveat, Charlie, do you want to say something?
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the level of granularity you want to get into now is where I'm headed, but if it's just a case of starting to like list functions and values, I mean, my brain goes to perforation. So how far into a forest block is the activity occurring? Degree of creation of edge habitat within a forest block. How much forest is being cleared? How much edge habitat is created given the layout of that clearing? So is that what we're getting at to now? Is that level of specificity, or are we still at like a couple levels above that specificity?
I think those are great suggestions as to how to think about an undue adverse impact. So yeah, keep riffing if you have more.
Well, I mean, we can keep brainstorming. I just didn't know if that was what you were if you wanted to dive in at that level, because I do think that's kind of where my brain goes to, is starting to list what are the functions and values that we want to protect, and things like perforation, edge habitat. Those are the things I start to think about in terms of a list.
Okay. I think Bob Zano has other items that might be on his list. So let me pass the mic to Bob.
Well, so we did this when we did create that list of functions, maybe not quite to the level that would serve what we need for this, but when we identified the landscape prioritization for each block, for each of the block types, we listed functions in the Vermont Conservation Design Report. And so I'm looking at interior forest blocks. The functions would be things like supporting natural ecological processes like predator-prey interactions and natural disturbance regimes, helping maintain air and water quality and flood resilience, supporting the biological requirements of many plant and animal species, especially those that require interior forest habitats, supporting viable populations of wide-ranging mammals, and there's more. But we have that sort of particular functions. But I guess I'm not quite sure whether you evaluate those function by function, or if you think about the mapping of the block is meant to encompass all of those functions, and changes to the block are sort of presumed to impact those functions. So I don't know if it would be a checklist like wetlands has, or like you were saying, or if it's just that the mapping is meant to encompass these things.
We'll go back to Charlie. Hold on, everybody.
No, I think what Bob is describing is spot on. And I think what I was coming at was kind of from maybe the other end of it, saying, for example, like, okay, you're creating a proliferation of edge habitat that's going to lead to the introduction of non-native invasives, that's going to reduce the functionality of the vegetative community to continue to. So I think like the values that Bob's listing are great. I think where my head was going is, what are the things we're looking at as far as what impacts those values? So I think it's kind of both ends of the same question.
Yeah, and I think the functions you listed, Bob, are broad, right? And important, but potentially hard to measure when it comes to a particular parcel and a particular development project. But it speaks to your suggestion, I think, of saying like any impact within the mapped area is an adverse impact. And that's the next question then is, can we differentiate that from undue? We're going to go to Jamie next, and hold on just a moment.
So I guess I'm wondering, do we need to focus on adverse? Because I guess I'm just looking at the statutory language, and it's, permit will not be granted for a development or subdivision within or partially within a forest block or habitat connector unless the applicant demonstrates that a project will not result in an undue adverse impact on the forest block or habitat connector. A project as proposed would result in an undue adverse impact. A permit may only be granted if effects are avoided, minimized, or mitigated as allowed in accordance with rules adopted by the board. So I wonder if you kind of almost go to, is this an undue adverse effect? And if so, you run the avoid, minimize, mitigate analysis. And I think we're kind of talking about how do you minimize, like avoid would be almost like Megan, what you were saying, like you're not in the forest, you're just basically in a de minimis, zone of already where development's occurring. And then I think we're kind of like, we should be talking about what are the standards or the design standards to minimize impacts. And if you can't minimize, then it's almost like, is mitigation allowed or not? So I'm just almost wondering, there's a way to simplify this a little bit and not get into adverse.
It's all kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
We're just looking at,
Hold
yeah,
on, Kirsten.
Avoid, minimize, mitigate. What is that? So, yeah, go ahead, Trey.
My question was going to be what do we mean by mitigate? Because you gave an example in the aesthetic criterion where, you might mitigate by changing an aspect of the design. So you mitigate the aesthetic impact. But when I think of mitigate, I often think about like the way that ag soils work or wetlands work, where you actually have to go out and protect some other place with those functions and values because you couldn't avoid or minimize the impact. So is that, did the legislature provide clarity on which of those they meant here? No. To me, this feels more like the latter than the former, because the avoid is already saying, how can you change the project to, not have the kinds of, to take it from undue adverse to adverse maybe. But then if you can't do that and you offer to, what is it, protect at a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 or whatever ratio, a similar block.
I think that's a great question, Trey. And there were several people in the rooms, with the legislative committees that were talking about this. Billy, do you want to speak to that? I'd like to hear from you as to the answer to that question, because I have my own feeling about what that meant. But
I think that there may be opportunities to mitigate through just protecting similar resources elsewhere. But for some of the functions, especially connectivity, it's very site specific. So in those instances, acceptable mitigation may only be actions that preserve the functionality at that location. So if you're going to develop half your parcel in a corridor, then there's some covenant or permit condition that restricts development on the balance of it. And if you can't do that, if you can't maintain the functional connectivity of that area, then maybe mitigation isn't possible for that project. You need to further avoid or minimize. Or you just don't pass go for that criteria. Those instances are very infrequent, but I think that would be possible. For forest blocks, I think the opportunity for like offsite or like mitigation banking is much higher.
And that's largely what I was thinking the mitigate meant was for forest blocks, it's similar to prime ag soils. Like if you can't avoid and minimize and redesign the project to meet that standard, and you have to have an impact that's above that, then you pay into a system that helps protect forest blocks elsewhere. Hold on. Let me just ask if anybody online would like to comment on this. I keep running around the room talking to folks in the room, but I want to make sure folks online have a chance to speak up. But I can't see you, so go ahead.
This is Annette. Nobody else has their hand up. I would like to suggest that we take off the table mitigate. And I think some of the best examples that we have of the types of things we're trying to assure don't happen are the wind projects, the Lowell Wind Project and the Deerfield Wind Project. And what concerns me, like the Deerfield Wind Project was in some of the finest bear habitat in the state. And that study that I posted makes it very clear that the bears don't use the habitat the way they did. So, okay, there was mitigation. Yes, some lands were set aside elsewhere that those same bears don't use. And so it all feels like a game that's not really protecting the resource or the wildlife. And I remember years ago talking to Pat Berry when he was at VNRC about deer yard mitigation, and he said it doesn't work. I mean, in Clarendon, there was a quarry where the deer yard was clear cut, and the neighbor put up a sign for the deer, go 8 miles that way. So I really do think that we need, as a group, to grapple with this idea of paying to preserve land somewhere else that probably wouldn't have been, harmed anyway. The other piece of this that I want us to talk about is this avoid, minimize, mitigate all seems to be enabling. And at what point do we give the opportunity to say no? And so I think that's going to be an important part of this discussion, is that there are types of developments that are going to be proposed. I envision like a series of starter castles up on a mountain with roads going in and people with plenty of money to be able to do whatever they want there and pay for it. And so, yeah, they can pay to do the Act 250. They can pay to mitigate somewhere else. When those sorts of things get proposed, how do we as a state want to protect our environment from those types of developments that are truly harmful? And Warren has his hand up.
Thanks, Annette. Yeah, I have some thoughts on that, but I'll hold my tongue. Warren, go ahead.
I agree with Billy and with what Annette just said. I don't think it's an either or. I haven't worked on this concept through 3 different bienniums for the ski areas, and at the time, the utilities. I think Billy's description of the steps and mitigation, I think Trey's observation are correct, because there have definitely been projects where, let me back up. The idea here was to provide some level of rigor and predictability when we're dealing with forest blocks and forest fragmentation type issues, because prior to that, there really is none for somebody that's proposing a project. So that's quite frankly why the ski areas, and I think others, came to the table and said, yes, let's do this, so we can have some level of understanding of what the rules of the road are when I want to do something, rather than have me find out what A&R wants from me in terms of minimization or mitigation being a complete unknown. So that's fundamental. But to Annette's point, there is language in the statute, and I think Billy mentioned this earlier, that contemplates that there are areas or parcels or situations where projects cannot be mitigated. So I don't know where those are, but the statute certainly contemplates that situation. So I don't think it needs to be taken off the table, but I don't also know exactly how we identify those types of locations. And if it's something you can do beforehand, or it really is contextual to the project and the specific location where it's being proposed.
Thanks, Warren. That was the thing I wanted to say in response to Annette, was yes, that part of statute that says that through the rulemaking process, we're supposed to determine whether mitigation is even possible in certain circumstances. The assumption being that sometimes it won't be possible, and you won't be able to buy your way out of it just because you have a large bank account. Jamie, you were going to say something. I wanted to come to you next.
Yeah, no, that's what I was going to share. As I recall the conversation, this just did come up, and there was a sensitivity to the fact that there are going to be times when mitigation isn't appropriate, but the balancing act here was to settle on mitigation, being an option if it's appropriate. We have to have a conversation to offer some guidance to the LURB on what those circumstances would be. But my recollection too is that this shouldn't be seen as pay to play, that you have to go through the avoid, you have to go through the minimize, and then you have to understand is mitigation an option. You can't just go to mitigation. And that was my understanding, is it's a 3-step process. And you first have to demonstrate whether it's possible to avoid. And if you can, you should. And that's how you then get to an undue adverse. And if you can't, then you look at, have I tried to minimize this? And if you can't minimize the impacts, then, only then do you go to mitigation, and we have to understand what circumstances that would be allowed and at what ratio. Is that consistent with what folks remember as, yeah, Billy's given a thumbs
Yes.
up.
Thanks, Warren.
An a la carte menu.
You have to like take all practical measures to avoid, all practical measures to minimize. And then once you've exhausted your opportunities to avoid and minimize, then a discussion happens as to whether mitigation is possible to address the impact.
Okay, let me bring the mic over to Charlie and then we'll go back to the Teams folks if anybody wants to speak next. Here, Charlie.
So I just wanted to offer that I think in terms of the forest block mitigation, there are some features that Bob described that I think we can kind of help to narrow the scope of where the mitigation would occur. Thinking about biophysical regions, the geology prioritization, with the idea that if you're doing a project in, say, the Champlain Valley, mitigation in the Orange County uplands might not be appropriate, or vice versa, because the geology is different. And so you can narrow the scope by biophysical region and some other factors that we do have things that play into the prioritization. I think where it gets really tricky is when you start to look at things like, and I'll use bear habitat as an example, and I think it gets tricky here because of, I think one is the mitigation has to be proportional to the impact. And so there is a question of how many different projects need to create, quote, mitigation banking to then go conserve the forest that you're concerned about. And then I can't help but go back to that idea that forests change over time, and black bear habitat is a good example of one where areas designated as black bear habitat, now faced with beech leaf disease, we might not have beech there in 30 years. And so I don't know how we take that into account when we're thinking about mitigation in terms of what we can control versus what we can't control, what's hopefully not going to change, geology, hopefully not going to change, whereas vegetation on the ground can change. And so I struggle with that degree of clarity and mitigation.
Anybody in the Teams world want to speak up? Annette, you're sort of our mediator in there. Anybody got their hand up?
There are no hands up.
Okay.
Oh,
thanks,
wait,
Annette.
Dory has her hand up. Here she goes.
You just made me think of a scenario that is likely to happen, which is a project that has a deer wintering area that is within their forest block that would be eligible for mitigation. Mostly, there are few situations where I see that's not an option. And then how is that going to, and we're talking about, beech or oak stands, which we often get into a mitigation scenario. How do those weave together in forest block mitigation? Not to say anyone needs to answer that question. It just occurred to me that we're going to have a lot of overlap.
Good point. Bob Zeno has something to say on that. Hold on.
I just want to say that issues like that have come up in some of the Section 248 projects that I've been involved with. And oftentimes those end up being very overlapping and complementary rather than like leading you in very different directions.
Okay. So hold on, Kirsten. Let me bring the mic to you so everybody can hear you.
I'm still a little bit trying to flesh out like what's meant by minimize. Like now, Charlie, you had some, thoughts, I think, around edge perforations, degree of penetration. Is that an approach without looking at maybe having to go to the level of specificity of looking at all the individual functions and values and doing that kind of assessment, maybe somewhat similar to what one might do for a wetland impact evaluation? Like, is there a way that's scientifically supported to make it a little bit more straightforward with, sort of like, I don't want to say like a geometric approach, but kind of more, and maybe I'm trying to fit a square peg into a round hole or whatever. My background is in civil engineering, so I try to, I like it when things can be sort of clearly, mapped out and measured, but I appreciate this is not easy to define. So, yeah, go ahead. Bob's.
I can think of cases that have involved significant natural communities and were rare and irreplaceable natural areas. So a little bit more of a discrete thing, or at least a more confined thing. But I mean, steps like looking at the layout of a development, and you've got 20 units, and are they all spread out, and the wastewater and stormwater are all spread out? Can that just be condensed or so? I mean, I think that's the simplest form of minimization that's going to keep coming up again and again with this criterion. Just put everything closer together. Yeah.
I think that there's probably a way through like the design guidance requirements of the rule to like give examples of common minimization practices that will probably be sufficient in a large number of cases where you don't need to like really parse those functions and values and see exactly what's happening. If you generally minimize your impact against this resource, you're good to go. There will be examples where the resource is so significant that it's going to be a more granular analysis that's going to have to be conducted. But I think those are going to be super infrequent, would be my sense. So yeah, I think the answer to your question, Kirsten, is like yes, and there may be some outliers that need kind of one-off responses. If that makes sense.
This is
Yeah.
Annette.
Go ahead,
Can I
Annette.
So I'm back in 2003, I went around and did focus groups of people in a number of different areas of Vermont, asking them to tell me their issues with Act 250 from the citizen participation perspective. And when I was in Chittenden County, there was one group that talked about a housing development that was proposed on a fairly large parcel. It had wetlands, it had agricultural lands, and the development was kind of a grid pattern and use the whole thing. And because of the citizen involvement, they were able to get it redesigned so that things were more clustered and that there was a lot more than open land and the wetlands weren't touched. So the geometry and what was just described is it certainly has worked in more suburban or urban settings. But I guess my question to the scientists is, does that work in a forest habitat and connectivity setting? Would that same thing, yes, it would minimize it, but would it still enable the functions? And it's probably a case by case evaluation, but that's how I'm thinking of this. Is there a direct correlation, or how is it different?
I really like that question. I like the focus on the function again. And I think that our A&R reps have talked a little bit about or Billy and Bob have, about the difference between habitat connectors and just forest blocks in general. And I kind of agree that there are differences there, and there's a lot more flexibility to minimize your impact in creative ways in just forest blocks, and there may be a lot less in specific habitat connectors that are determined by the landscape and the particular circumstance. But it's a good question. I like the focus on the function. Trey, you wanted to say something?
Well, I appreciate what Annette said too about it being probably very much fact specific in each case, and wonder if we could, next time when we meet, if we could look at a couple few examples of this and run through the avoid, minimize, mitigate scenario for them, just so that we can inform ourselves on how it would work in, on a 20-acre subdivision in the middle of an interior block, on a 20-acre subdivision proposed in a connectivity area, in Josh's example of something that triggers the road rule that goes way up in. I think we'll because it's a pretty slippery slope between avoid and minimize, or it's a fine line, or some other saying, but always being able to tease those apart is going to be hard sort of empirically, whereas I think is in situations we might be able to hone it in. And then you all were talking about maybe giving some of that kind of guidance. And, this is not a dispositive list, but these are examples of ways that you impact the functions and values. These are examples of ways that you minimize them. These are examples of how you avoid them. I think that would be really useful for me and in this setting, if we could do something like that.
Yeah, some scenario, examples that, yep.
Dan has his hand up.
Yeah,
All right, hold on, Dan. Hold on, Dan.
Just to follow up a little bit on what you were saying, Trey, so maybe a checklist of sort of design criteria, like site design criteria that get at avoidance and minimize, just conceptually could be part of what's the information.
That'd be really helpful for applicants.
Yeah, so we'll get there. We'll get there. Just for those that are familiar with just helping developers and applicants design subdivisions, there's nothing new here, right? This is what municipal plan review, subdivision review has been about for a very long time. And the concept of conservation subdivision, where you do clustering and you minimize your impact, we can have checklists, we can have pictures, diagrams that show this, not this, those sorts of things. I think we could potentially incorporate into the rules, and we won't have to do a lot of work to create those diagrams. They already exist. So Dan, hold on just a moment. I want to go to Charlie and then we'll go to you.
So I think with the forest, how do you minimize impacts in forests? A lot of the conversation we're having is around size, degree, and distribution of impact within an area. So clustering it, reducing the forest loss. That's one way to look at it. Another way that comes to mind, and this is where I think the state agencies would have to come into play to offer expertise and review, but another way to think about it, and this is less about current vegetative structure or successional stage, but thinking about natural communities, which is more about biophysical region aspect, geology, soils. I could see a project where the design has an undue impact on a underrepresented natural community within that forest block. So say you've got a large chunk of northern hardwood, but then you have a small chunk of rich northern hardwood or dry oak hornbeam area or something that's relative. Yeah, I'm not getting into the RHINA question necessarily, but like looking at the forest block, what is underrepresented within there? And then part of the design could say like, well, if you shift your design this way, you would reduce the impact on a relatively underrepresented natural community within the forest block. And the impact would be into one that has greater representation within the forest block. So it's not just about size of loss of cover, but where you're doing it. And I think we have enough data that, and again, I wouldn't expect the applicant to come in and say, I know all the natural communities, but if we can help provide that data, that's another way we can mitigate it within the forest block.
Whoa, lots of icicles are growing on my forehead at the thought of that, but that's really cool. To do that on a parcel level, I think would be really difficult, but
well, some of the coarse filter stuff we have, because we know that certain natural communities only occur on certain soil types or on certain bedrock or in certain places. So going into it, even just a 10,000 foot review of a project area, we could say, here's things we think we know might occur there. And a lot of this you could do without having to go out and actually do inventory work.
we don't regulate
them. But I'm not saying, well, yeah, so what I'm trying to think about is like, is there a way to find that happy medium where you're not creating this like undue scope of work to do this, but you could in a way figure out how you could shift a site design. I don't know. I also reserve the right to take this idea back.
Right. Let's
of forest blocks. So if we know they're present and there's opportunities to avoid them, that would be part of the review for sure. Yeah.
Okay. So
particularly like in the pre-application and into the process, I mean, we provide input on stuff like that.
Yeah.
We use our known data. We can provide input on what to look for. So that's definitely part of the process.
Okay, so we're
Can I just say
really quick because we're running out of time.
But Annette asked the question of, do we know that the minimization works? And I think that that's a good question, but it's not really one that is part of the statute because it's not so much does it prevent the impact. It's just, it takes it from undue to just adverse. So there's always going to be an adverse impact from a project, even if it's avoided, minimized, and mitigated.
Okay, so Dan, I told you I'd go to you. I will, but you got to make it quick because we're running out of time and we got to set up for the next meeting. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, you had said it very well, Alex, in terms there are a ton of examples out there, and the more we can give for different types of situations, the better, even if they do include different types of natural features in a given forest block. So I was just starting to anticipate our work product and what are we going to hand to the district coordinators and what might they hand to a potential land developer as the manual of written and graphic design guidelines for good avoidance and minimization on a given project. And so all of these ideas, I'm just starting to formulate how might we be able to package them in the most useful, clear, concise, consistent way possible.
That's why you're on this working group, Dan. Thank you. You're landscape architects like yourself are going to help us do that and think through it. All right. So I hate to cut anybody off, but we're running out of time. And I had budgeted a bunch of time for us to talk about additional information needs and next steps. I feel like we've had a lot of suggestions about additional information needs. Megan and Jean have talked about some mapping they'd like to see. Trey just talked about some scenario playing that maybe we could do next time. So I think we have something to work from for next time. Kirsten, is there anything that you want to say or you observe that to help us frame going forward?
I feel like this has been a good start. So thanks, everyone.
Are there any parting comments from the online folks as to something you'd like to see or definitely cover in more depth at the next meeting? I'm not hearing anyone, so I'll assume not. And yeah, so thanks for being here. The next meeting's October 10th. And Kirsten and I will endeavor to do a little more testing on the technology side to make sure we don't have this issue again. Thanks everybody for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.